Hi there and welcome back to 355 Code. Today we will be making another game and the game will be Othello. So for those of you who are not familiar, Othello is a game that's played on a 8x8 board where each player places a piece on their turn, and if there are any pieces that are stuck in between two pieces of identical color, they're flipped. If you're not so sure about the game, I would recommend checking it out online before following along with this tutorial. And this tutorial will be broken up into two parts. This video will be dealing with the basic functionality of building the board and the piece flipping. And the second video will be dealing with the logic of the game. So if you're really just interested in the logic and you want to build the board yourself, you can skip to the next video. And if you want to learn from scratch, then you can follow along from here. Don't forget, of course, to subscribe to our channel if you want to see more videos like this one. So let's get started. Before we actually start coding, let's kind of think step by step what we need to do for this project. So the first thing we need to do is build a board. And then on this board, we need to build a grid, 8x8, and then we need to add pieces, and then we need to give the pieces the ability to flip. So let's go through each of these steps and actually code it out. And as usual, we'll be doing just vanilla JavaScript. We just have a basic HTML page set up here on the side, a boilerplate. You don't even need to touch that, and CSS, there's nothing here. I just move those both aside, and we'll be adding all of the elements and all of the styles just using plain JavaScript. So let's start out by adding our board. So we're just going to define a constant. We're going to call it board, and we're just going to use the basic create element. So if you're not familiar with manipulating the DOM and stuff like that, you might want to read up a bit about that and watch some tutorials before this, or you can just copy the code and follow along for the rest. So we're going to create a div, and let's give this div some basic styling. So let's give it a background color. Background color of green, because that's the traditional Othello board color. And then we'll just attach this board to the body of our document, and we're going to do that with append child. And just append board. So if we run our code now, you'll see that we don't really see anything because I haven't given the board any kind of dimensions. And we'll get to that soon after we add our first pixel. So, after we add our first grid. So to create this grid, basically we're going to want to be adding another div, and let's call this grid. Okay, and this will just basically be a square on our board, and it's also going to be a create element. It's also going to be a div, and let's give this grid some styling as well. So this grid will have a border, and let's give it a height and a width. So let's give it a height of let's start with 10 pixels and see how that looks, and let's give it a width as well. So everything I'm doing here you could technically also do using CSS. But since we are really very JavaScript focused and we want to practice our JavaScript, so I'm really doing this all in plain vanilla JavaScript. And it does have uses. There are some times that you will want to change this style using JavaScript. And now we're going to basically append this grid to our board. So that would be board.append child grid. So let's take a look at what we have now here. So now you can see, we can see our board now because we gave it a height using its child, the grid. So now we have one grid square within our board. Let's change it up a little bit so it's a little bit bigger, just for visibility's sake. Let's run that again. Okay, great. That's a little better. So basically what we're going to need to do is we are going to need to add 64 of these squares into this board, and they're going to need to be in an 8x8 grid. So let's start by adding 64 of these squares. So in order to do that, we're going to be using a loop, and it's going to be a for loop. So 0, and as long as I is smaller than 64, I++. Okay, so basically it's going to execute this code 64 times. And now basically if we would run this, it would add 64 squares, one after the other. One thing I'm going to want to add here is just giving each square its own ID, because it's best that each element in our on our website will have its own ID and they won't share any IDs. So let's give this each an ID. We might need that later on to tap into each individual grid square. So let's set an attribute of ID, and the ID will be dependent on where it is in the grid. So we'll just call it grid and then plus I. Okay, and that way each one of these will now have, so this one will be ID grid 0, grid 1, grid 2, etc. Okay, so we're making a lot of progress. And now basically what we need to do is to kind of style this so that our grid here is really 8x8 and not just one long column of squares. So we're going to do that by adding some more styling to our board. So we're going to be using the grid display setting. So display will be equal to grid, and we'll give it we'll define its columns and its rows. So we're going to be using something called repeat, which basically creates a grid with, sorry, this is going to be grid template columns, and it's going to be the same for columns and rows, so we'll pretty much be copying this code, and we're just going to say repeat 8 20 pixels. Okay, so basically what this does is it will create 8 columns. Each one will be 20 pixels wide, which should be perfect for our squares that we created. And let's really just copy this line over. And then we're just going to be changing it to template rows. So let's change that right over here. Excellent. So let's run our code and see what happened here. Great. So we see we have now an 8x8 grid. We're going to add something called gap, which kind of gives a little space in between each of these. If you like this styling like this, you can leave it like this. I personally prefer if there's a small gap in between. And let's just make it 3 pixels. let's run that. Great. So now they're kind of a little more spread out. And let's fit the width of the board to the content so that it's not kind of smeared all the way to the right now as it is now. So to do that, we need to change the width of the board to fit content. And check that out. So you see I'm kind of like running the code after each thing I add just to see that it's having the effect that I want. And if it doesn't, then I would kind of change it up a bit. And the last thing I'll do is add some padding, just so that it's, you see kind of here, it's looks like the grid is kind of coming out from on top of the board. So we could solve that with some padding. So let's add just, let's say 5 pixels padding and run that, and great. So you can see it's a little uneven still, but I'm not going to go too deep into the aesthetics of things. If you want to go down in your code and figure out how to fix that up, you can. But now you can see we have a grid, and it's sitting very comfortably on the board. So congratulations, you've done a lot so far, and we've built a board, we've built a grid, and now basically what we're going to want to do is add pieces. Okay, and the way we're going to do that is by adding a click event to the each of these grids, because basically what we want to happen is that when you click on one of these, it will display a piece. Okay, so let's do that by adding a so I'm going to take this this kind of task that we have here, and I'm going to add it over here inside our build a grid. And we're going to do grid.add event listener, and because I'm kind of putting this within our for loop, it's going to add this event listener to each of these squares individually, and that's pretty important here. So if you need to take a second to wrap your head around that, please do. And this is basically the function of what's going to happen when we click on each one of these grid pieces. So what do we actually want to happen when we click on one of these grid pieces? Basically what we're going to want to do is add another element inside of it that's going to be the piece. So let's start by defining a new, by declaring a new element, and we'll just call it piece, and it will be also equal to just a div element. Div. Excellent. And let's give it some styling. So what do we want these pieces to be? We want these pieces to have a height and a width. So let's give it a height, and let's make it, let's say 15 pixels, because we want to fit inside the grid. And let's give it a width, also 15 pixels, right? It's just a circle. And let's make it a circle, and we'll do that by adjusting the border radius. So piece.style.border radius, and that will be equal to 50%, and that'll make it a complete circle. So let's try running our code and see what happens now. Okay, so great. So I am clicking on one of these grids, and nothing is happening, and that is because we need to append the piece to the grid. So let's grid.append child piece. And now let's test our code one more time. And still nothing is happening. So let's take a second to figure out what is going on. So basically, I haven't given any background color or border to the piece. So it could be that the piece is there, we just can't see it. So let me just add a border. And we'll just make it solid. So let's try that again one more time. Excellent. Okay, so now you see each time I click on one of these grid squares, a piece comes up. And let's just give it a bit of a margin so that it's kind of sitting in the middle. So let's give it a margin of 2.5 pixels. Let's see how that looks. And oops, gotta spell things right. Okay, that's a little too much. Let's try 1.5. And that's pretty much in the middle. Not gonna get too crazy about it. Okay, great. So now we're adding pieces, and our pieces are kind of in the middle of the grid. So that's perfect. Now, basically, what we want to do is decide what the color of each of these pieces will be. And basically, the way this game works is that there's someone who's black and someone who's white, and or two other colors. And basically, the person who is so you put down one black piece and then one white piece, and one black piece, one white piece, and that is how. And basically, we want to alternate turn by turn between black and white. So basically, what we're going to want to do is make a variable, and this variable is going to decide what the color of this piece is. So I'm really going to declare this variable right up here, even before we build the board, and I'm just going to call it game turn, okay, because the color basically has to do with whose turn it is to play. And we're going to start off with white as the first player. You can change this to other colors or black and start, it's really up to you. And basically the background color of the piece is going to be decided by this game turn variable. So background color will be equal to game turn. Okay, and now you'll see that if we run the code, then these pieces should all be white. And now basically what we just need to do is to switch over the game turn after a piece has been placed. So we're going to just do that using an if clause over here. So if game turn is equal to white, then game turn is equal to black. Okay, and we're going to add an else for the case that that the game turn is black, and then in that case we're just going to change it back to white. Excellent. So let's test out our code now, and basically we should see an alternation between black and white. And excellent. So you can see it's turn by turn. The pieces are placed on the board where I click. So we're done with this part of our tutorial. And basically what you've done is you've built a board, you've built a grid on the board, and you've built the ability to add pieces to each square on the board in alternating colors, which is basically the foundation for our game. The next thing that we're going to need to do is basically add the logic, and the logic is basically that in this case, for example, if we have a white and then two blacks, and then I put another white here at the end, these two black pieces should flip over to be white. And the same is true for horizontal, and the same should be for diagonal. So that's what we're going to be doing in the next video. So please, if you like this video, make sure to subscribe so you can see when the next video comes out. And I'll see you next time.